When I was in college, every week I would line up with my sisters outside of our sorority house and prepare to enter our chapter meeting. There was a dress code. There are no jeans or t-shirts allowed at chapter meetings, and from what I can remember at that time, although I think it may have changed, we had to have a dress or a skirt. We had a whole collection of oh no, we have to dress up for the sorority, pull this on. Yes, and that is amazing because you have never seen me in a dress or a skirt. I know that's what you're all thinking, so we might as well just say it, except for this dress, which is very acceptable. The door to our meeting space was locked. Even if you lived in the sorority house, you had to go outside when it was time for chapter meeting, and you stood in line, and only the president and the doorkeeper, who's one of the elected officers, remained inside. And when it was time, they unlocked the door and stood at the doorway, and each of us had to do the secret handshake. And yes, there was a secret handshake, and we had to give the password. And yes, there was a secret password to enter the meeting. And if you weren't dressed appropriately, or if, I don't know how you would forget the handshake or the password, but if you didn't give the right information, if you weren't appropriately set up to enter, you could be refused entry. And of course, there was more to being a member of the sorority than dressing appropriately for chapter meetings and knowing the right words and handshake. There was an entire code of conduct enforced by a sorority officer entitled the Standards Chair. Standards included everything from dress codes for a variety of events, not just chapter meetings, to things like you could not smoke a cigarette unless you were sitting down. It was unladylike to be standing up or walking around if you smoked. Not that many of us smoked, but that was a regulation. If you violated the standards of the sorority, you could be disaffiliated. You'd no longer wear the letters or be in community with the group. You're wondering what that has to do with Psalm 15. Does anybody have a guess what it has to do with Psalm 15? All right, I'll just get you off the hook. So one of the things that was fascinating to me when I joined the sorority was how overtly Christian the ritual was, right down to including a psalm that we had to recite at every meeting. That psalm was Psalm 15. And we recited it in King James. So, Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? Etc., etc., etc. And at face value, Psalm 15 appears to be its own kind of mini standards code. I'm going to read to you from the Message, which is another translation of the Bible, and this is how the Message puts it. God, who gets invited to dinner at your place? How do we get on your guest list? Walk straight, act right, tell the truth, don't hurt your friend, don't blame your neighbor, despise the despicable, keep your word even when it costs you, make an honest living, never take a bribe. You'll never get blacklisted if you live like this. The psalm is attributed to David, and I can imagine it being somewhat aspirational, a reminder of how to enter God's presence, how to be in the house with God, how to be in close proximity with God. But I have a problem with the psalm. The words matter. They shape our understanding of God, and I have a problem with this psalm because it goes against my understanding of God's grace. I have no problem with an aspirational list. I believe all the things David itemizes characterize a life that brings us into relationship with God. We could think of it like the door of the sorority house. When we live a life that is true to God, when we live a life that reflects God's values and desires, we enter into God's house. We enter into close proximity with God, an intimate space where we experience God and all that God has to offer. Now, this is different because we've been in COVID, but think about it. even when we started to open up a little bit, when you go into someone's house or you host someone in your house, you have invited intimacy. This is your dwelling place. It's the place that holds your essence, the place where you let your guard down and are vulnerable. When we orient our lives towards God, we enter into God's dwelling space. As I said at our chapter meetings, we recited the King James Version of the psalm, "Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill?" I like the idea of replacing who with how. Lord, how shall we abide in thy tabernacle? How shall we dwell in thy holy hill? Because unlike the sorority, everyone has the opportunity to enter. You don't have to be specially selected and anointed, but in order to get in the house, you have to know the code. But it's not secret. Not like the handshake and the password. The code is announced right here in this psalm and throughout the biblical narrative. Our stories teach us how to connect with God, to enter into communion with God, to dwell with God. The last verse in the King James translation reads, "He that doeth these things shall never be moved." And you'll remember the Message translates it this way: you'll never get blacklisted if you live like this. I disagree. God's love is bigger than our efforts. God doesn't keep a list of people who are out. God does not disaffiliate people like a sorority can. You are on God's list of beloveds, period. End of story. And even if you don't live like this, if you try to live like this and you mess up, or if you never try to live like this, you are on God's list of beloveds. And for me, as a Christian, that's what's resonating with me most at this moment in history. God is not about banishing people. God's mercy and love are expansive. But that's not what the culture around us affirms. The sorority structure was a microcosm of our culture. There were people who were in and people who were out. Meet the standards, reap the benefits, violate the standards, leave the community. Now, there are, in certain situations, times when it's appropriate to ask someone to leave a community for the health of all involved. I want to be clear about that. But to me, it seems like more often we designated someone outside of the community because they were not meeting our standards. Standards that were nothing more than a way to designate who's in and who's out. This matters to me at this time in history because our country is so divided. And I think many of us are tempted to take people off our list, people whose worldview seems different from ours. In the United States, we experience a daily clash of worldviews that contradict each other, and as we try to find a way forward, I suspect some people feel like they've won and others feel like they've lost. Some feel like they've been let into the house, and others feel like they've been banished. All of us are on God's list of beloveds. So the question is, how will that impact how you walk in the world? How will that impact how you dwell with God? Amen.